Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at public attitudes to the economy. How do people think of the economy, and in particular, why do they often support fiscal austerity? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Economic policy clearly matters to us all. The dictum, "It's the economy, stupid," or, in other words, the view that the state of the economy is the primary driver of election results, is often taken as a given. But we can understand the implications of that dictum only if we understand how people in fact view the economy. Do people look at their own good or at the good of society as a whole? Do they look forwards or backwards? What do they think good means in this context in the first place? These are questions that have long occupied political scientists, but sometimes that research has perhaps been shaped by rather narrow assumptions about how we think of our economic interests. Well, one scholar who has made a career out of breaking new ground in this field is my colleague, Professor Lucy Barnes. Lucy recently gave her brilliant inaugural lecture as Professor of Political Economy here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and that gives us an excellent excuse to explore her fascinating research here today. Lucy, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. And so, as I suggested, their public attitudes on economic matters have long been explored by students of politics. What are the unanswered questions that got you into this research area and that drive your own research agenda today?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here as usual. In terms of unanswered questions on public attitudes, I need to take a little bit of a step back because my original kind of overarching interests are not only in public attitudes, but really in the big picture of economic policy making. Because I've always been more interested in the policy side, kind of what comes out of politics, because I think it affects people in very real ways, as opposed to the more kind of who's going to win horse race side, which to me is important because it affects those downstream outcomes. And I definitely started out with more kind of macro comparative interests, like why are some countries better at achieving certain good outcomes than other countries are? But after my PhD and as I've kind of worked more and more in this area, the good scientific evolution story is that I realized how impossible it is to accurately answer these questions empirically. And so I focused in on questions about individuals which have more credible methods available to actually get empirical evidence on what might cause what. Although the slightly less good scientific answer is that this is somewhat of a trend in the discipline, and I've just jumped on that bandwagon and followed it there. So certainly focusing in on public attitudes has come from some of both of those two motivating forces. But I do think that we lack a balanced view of how people think about the economy. As you intimated in your opening remarks, I think there has been a focus on differences between people that can be very readily traced back to objective material interests. And there's a good reason for that, which is much easier to tell a story where those objective interests lead to the attitudes and are not, in fact, caused by the attitudes. It's not totally trivial, but it seems more plausible. As compared to where I think these unanswered questions are, which you highlighted, which is, well, what about the views people have that really aren't very readily reducible to what's in it for me? Where do they come from and what are their consequences? And even how do they fit together? Do they fit together? The closest that I think we've come to this is thinking about ideology. But again, that's very broad and in some ways narrow in its own way, in that political scientists, I think, have a model of what a social democratic ideology looks like, or a left-wing economic ideology looks like, and what, on the other hand, a laissez-faire or a more right-wing ideology looks like. And we very much focused on, do people think like that? Rather than taking a little bit more of the kind of bottom-up approach and asking, well, how do people think in the first place? And then, next step, does it look like an ideology? Is it coherent? Is it consistent? Is it stable through time? So that's where I've got to, and I think that some of these the unanswered questions to which you alluded really are in identifying the patterns in people's thinking about what the economy as a social thing should look like, which is possibly different, but actually we just don't know, from the question of my personal economy and what that looks like.
That's really interesting, and there's a lot to unpack there. Let me go back to the start, actually, because what you said about where you began your research is really intriguing. So you said that you started off being interested in what drives better economic outcomes, in a sense, and then you moved on to focusing on people's attitudes. Presumably that move wasn't an abandonment of the initial idea. Presumably you think understanding people's attitudes to the economy is important because they have some role in shaping economic outcomes as well.
Yeah, I go back and forth on this one a little bit, because the intellectually motivating answer, and to some extent the professionally self-serving answer, is, of course, popular opinion is the key driver of democratic politics, and politicians must do what voters want, or else they can't get away with it, and they'll be kicked out of office. And certainly I think in the kind of medium-term historiography of political economy, there has been this move towards taking the electoral politics of political economy more seriously since the mid-2000s, as compared to a very interest groups focused tradition from really the 70s through the 90s, really focused on trade unions and employers associations and so on. So I think, that electoral turn sets me up to say, absolutely, parties and governments respond to their voters, therefore the attitudes of the voters shape the policy, and so we need to understand what the people want, because that dictates what the countries get. I'm not actually totally sure that's the case. I do think that the attitudes of voters are appealed to by policymakers as justifications of the policies that they pursue. As such, it matters what those policymakers perceive preferences to be, or, if you're being very cynical, what they think they can get away with saying that those preferences are. So I think that indirectly can be consequential in that sense. And I actually don't subscribe to the cynical view. I think that there is a real intention amongst elected politicians in particular to serve the interests and to some extent the preferences of those people that they're representing. But I do think that the epistemological challenge for those policymakers is quite severe. How do they know unless people like me are around to try and help them figure out what those attitudes really are?
I guess one of the books that made me think most last year was Paul Johnson's book on economic policy in the UK. And basically what I took from his book was, as an economist, I know lots of policies that would make things better, that would simultaneously give us higher growth, lower inequality, and more rapid climate transition. But we can't introduce these policies because, to use the standard phrase, the politics is too hard. And the politics being too hard is often a perception that, well, the public just won't buy it. And therefore it often seems to me that policymakers at least do feel constrained in the economic policies that they can introduce by, maybe it is just a perception of public preferences on the economy rather than reality, but it does seem to be quite important. And I think Paul Johnson's take, as I read it at least, was that it's actually really fundamental in stopping us from pursuing some policy directions that would make all of our lives better.
I think that's right. I think that there is a very real feeling of constraint. And in some ways, I'm a little bit of a contrarian by nature. And so one of my motivating, bugbears is, but is there really? It's kind of trying to check on whether all of those constraints are as real as they are perceived to be. And I mean, I think, I don't want to anticipate the direction that we go in too much, but this is where some of this taxation paper that we had talked about came from, in the sense that I do think tax policy is one area where politicians feel particularly constrained. We could not possibly introduce a mansion tax because of the popular reaction, or inheritance taxation seems like a good idea. I forget if this is one of the types of policies that Paul highlights in his book, but certainly taxing real property is economically efficient, often quite egalitarian, and yet is seen to be one of these areas where it's very difficult to make progress against the headwinds of public opinion. Now, I've always been somewhat intrigued by this because it is true that you tend to get an uproar when these kinds of proposals come up. But they're always introduced as, here is a tax increase, and the form that this increase will take is an increase in, let's say, the inheritance tax rates or a lowering of the threshold of inheritance taxation. And so there you're really asking, quote unquote, the public two questions at once. One, do you think that taxing this thing is the right kind of thing to tax, inheritance? And two, should taxes go up? And if and when people respond with absolutely not, I think we've often interpreted the signal as people hate this type of tax. But actually we may just be getting the signal of, well, without any obvious benefit, I would just prefer that taxes didn't go up, full stop. And it's not actually about the inheritance tax. And so the paper that I alluded to was our attempt to separate these two things out and to actually ask people about the types of taxes that they more or less prefer in the absence of that corresponding taxes are going to go up, which we know, or we think, shouldn't really be that popular, whether from a kind of pocketbook reason or just, I think, even on a more socially oriented perspective. No one's out there dreaming of a high tax state as their utopia, in its own right.
Yeah, so that's very interesting because that relates to one of the books that I read last year that I found most interesting, which was Paul Johnson's book on economic policy in the UK. And basically, my interpretation of what he said was that he, as an economist, knows various policies that would simultaneously make us richer, reduce inequality, and tackle climate change more quickly. And they're not introduced simply because, as it's often put, the politics is too hard, and which basically means policymakers think the public would not let them get away with it, and they would be punished at the ballot box if they pursued those policies. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think there is that very real perception on the part of policymakers that those constraints are there. Some work that I've been doing that relates to this is a paper that's going to come out hopefully this year on taxation, as much of my work has kind of started in that tax policy space, that tries to get at this feeling of constraint by making sure that we're asking the right questions when we ask the question of what will the public wear. And so in particular, when it comes to taxation, I think we often see it's something like, here's a new tax on inheritance, increasing the rate by a certain amount or decreasing the threshold in order to raise this additional revenue for the government. What do you think about this? Do you like it or not? And the difficulty with that kind of question as a guide to what the real constraints are is that it's bundling up two things. One, the level of taxation overall. Here is a tax increase. What do you think of it? And two, a kind of more conditional kind of question, which is like, well, if we had to do a tax increase, how would you feel about it being on inheritance? And so, a lot of Paul's work is in that kind of fiscal space where it is talking about what's the right structure of taxation, as well as or instead of its level. But as a public opinion question, we really just bundle those two together and we're not completely sure. So this paper that I have with two co-authors here, Ben Lauderdale and Julia de Romemont, is trying to separate out that revenue size of government question from the what taxes should we use if we need to raise that revenue question. And this is very much from a revenue focus, but it speaks to perhaps inequality reducing, efficiency enhancing, climate transitioning incentives that one might also be able to build in if you were an excellent economist like they have over at the IFS, and Paul Johnson is drawing on all of that work. And so what I guess we find two, I think, interesting headline results from that paper from the perspective of this political constraint question. One is that there's quite a lot of difference across taxes in how popular they are when you pit them against another way to raise that amount of revenue. So instead of saying, hey, Alan, would you like to increase the personal income tax main rate? We say, hey, Alan, would you rather increase that main income tax rate or increase VAT or increase fuel duty or increase the corporation tax rate? And we do this for 23 different levers of taxation that currently exist in the British system. And if we were really getting it right, and there was no room to move, that if we really were constrained on these questions of tax structure because we're already at the perfect point as far as public opinion is concerned, then the marginal changes in each tax should be roughly equally popular. And that's really not what we find. We find quite big differences between the most popular and the least popular. So that makes us think that, at least from the public opinion side, there is room for improvement. Now, whether that room is in the direction that politicians would want to move is a slightly different question. The second thing, which I think is really interesting from the perspective of constraint and from the perspective of the nature of the public opinion question and problem, this twofold one between the level and the structure, is in contrast to when we ask questions about levels. On these questions of the relative popularity of different taxes, we see a huge amount of consensus across income groups, across education groups, across parties, across Leave Remain. So there are differences, and the obvious ones are the partisan differences between supporters of parties of the left and of the right in how much taxation do you think the government should be doing? And we don't try to naysay that at all. But for a given size of government, for a given tax cut, we can cut £1 billion from the amount we raise in the council tax or the amount we raise in corporation tax. Conservatives and Labour voters agree that we should much prefer to cut council tax rather than corporation tax. And so, first of all, there's room for manoeuvre. And second of all, it doesn't appear like there's an obvious voter block that is, really preventing this, because there is this general consensus across those different support groups.
It's fascinating. There are so many topics in relation to economic policy that you're doing research on here. So let's focus then on austerity, because that's a kind of nice concrete example of where a lot of these themes come up. And I think I'm right in saying this is an area where there was a bit of kind of a puzzle emerging from the existing literature. We as political scientists often like to have a puzzle to start off with. There was a puzzle with the existing literature that you sought to explore through your...
My work on this started, or was inspired back in 2010 when, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we saw a shift across Europe, but especially in the UK, to this proposal for austerity, which, with only a little bit of kind of straw man shorthand, is we're going to take away those public services and public transfers that, in general, voters tend to like, and possibly also increase taxes, which voters tend to not like, in the service of paying down a deficit, which is this kind of highly abstract. The benefits of doing so are in the future. What's in it for me is very hard to directly track back. And so from the perspective of thinking about people's response to economic policy as one which is kind of, how is this going to affect my pocketbook? It's hard to imagine that this would be a successful electoral strategy.
Just before you move on, so I'm always intrigued by this word pocketbook, because I'm sure no one under the age of about 70 has ever seen a pocketbook.
Right.
But I guess it's just the jargon that is used in this literature to describe people thinking about their own self-interest. Their own
Monzo account voter. Yeah, right, exactly. So the pocketbook, it's where you keep your money. Right, but so that kind of from that self-interested perspective, the austerity proposition is, I, the government, will take more, you, the voter, will have less. And why? Well, because it's essential for things which we can maybe agree are important, but are certainly intangible and a little bit more distant than less money in your pocket. That is economic stability, that is, the fairness to future generations, or many of these things. And so that was the puzzle.
Yeah, so right? The puzzle is, we would expect people would not want this austerity policy, and yet here we have governments being elected and pursuing it.
Right, and there's a kind of telling quote in the Labour's post-game analysis of the 2015 election, which is that the Conservatives hadn't won in spite of austerity, but they had won because of it. So, this idea that this was actually a policy which, despite its adverse material consequences for voters in general, was nevertheless kind of supported. I think that austerity also, when it first kind of came on the scene, was relatively new as an issue. And so not only did it not that easily fit into a material self-interest point of view, it wasn't, and I think people will dispute this a little bit, depending on the country that you're in, it wasn't obvious that this should be something that is very left-right structured, because by 2010, nobody was really a Keynesian, even the leftists, right?
Are you supporting state intervention?
Well, or not so much state intervention, but are you supporting deficit spending in order to do macroeconomic management?
Yeah.
Most left parties by 2010 had kind of got on board with delegating that dynamic management to monetary policy and to relatively independent central banks. So which in the 70s you might be forgiven thinking, oh, left parties are probably going to be more likely to borrow because they have this intention to regulate the economy through fiscal policy. But 2010 left parties were not doing that and had not done that for generations. So the idea that there should be some really natural affinity between the left and more borrowing and the right and less borrowing wasn't totally obvious as a matter of logic. It did end up, I think, becoming, at least in the UK, a matter of fact in public perception. And, we'll never know how much that was to do with purely Labour incumbency during the financial crisis when this initial explosion of borrowing happened. But so we didn't have material explanations, and we didn't immediately have obvious, quote-unquote, ideological explanations. So where were people going to get their ideas about whether they should support austerity or not from? And I think there were two kind of parts of what, we, and when I say we, this is myself and also Tim Hicks, my collaborator on these papers, is a long-term project.
And another of our colleagues here at UCL.
Exactly. We saw two things kind of going on as we were living through this period as well. And one was, and again, this is a slightly more UK than general observation, but the media leadership on opinion here. And the other is that was part of that media story, and one which was very much criticised by certain economists, the use of an analogy to a household budget as a reason why government borrowing needed to be reduced really quickly. And so we looked at kind of both of these explanations, if you will, for public support for deficit reduction, and in some cases like really quite aggressive deficit reduction in a couple of papers, kind of leaning into that non-material, but how do people in the real world get their views or organise their thinking about some of these macroeconomic policy questions.
So you found that people do actually care about the size of the budget deficit. First of all, we should just make that clear. So that was not just something that appeared to be going on in the kind of real world, but when you did the research, it was indeed the case that people do care about the size of the budget deficit. They do think that austerity is sometimes necessary. You were looking at me quite sceptically, so maybe I'm getting this wrong.
I don't think you're getting it wrong. I think we would say that borrowing was very important and people didn't like it. When asked about what the important national level economic problems are, borrowing, I think, loomed large for 10 years.
Yeah.
How important that is to people in the grand scheme of their lives,
So the important thing, therefore, is, so we have this, from the point of view of some of the prior theory, at least, surprising result that people care about this thing or attach importance to this thing that seems to be adverse to at least their short-term personal. How can that be? How does that come about? And the idea is that, the ideas that you explored, well, maybe this reflects ideas in the media that people are picking up a lot, and in particular that these ideas are being framed in terms of this household analogy, as it's sometimes called, this analogy between household debt, which people think is a bad thing, and national debt, which economists will tell you is a totally different thing, but if you make them sound like the same thing, then potentially people will kind of transfer their views of household debt onto the national debt. Exactly. And what did you find on those points?
On the first point, we found that media ideas do seem to really matter. They matter in a descriptive sense, in that our main way into this was to look at newspaper coverage, broadsheet coverage in the UK, because the written word is very readily studyable. But we also felt it was not unrepresentative of different kind of parts of the media landscape. And we focused on the Guardian and the Telegraph, so the major left-wing oriented broadsheet and a major right-wing leaning in the UK. These kind of ideological positions are relatively uncontroversial, I think. And so descriptively, Telegraph readers and Guardian readers had very different views about how it was to reduce the deficit. We analysed the content of the way that the issue was covered, and we found that indeed the two papers did tend to emphasise different facets of what it would mean to reduce the deficit or not very quickly. And then finally, in a kind of experimental piece of work, we presented respondents with, on the one hand, an argument that sought to kind of emulate the way that the Telegraph was talking about borrowing. So this could lead to very severe economic difficulties if we don't reduce the deficit quickly. We might end up in the kind of problems that were then current in Europe and that had been highly salient and were a very salient feature of the Telegraph's coverage of issues of the deficit. It was very European in nature, as opposed to presenting people with a kind of Guardian coverage, which was making the argument that perhaps if we could focus on economic growth, we wouldn't need to make those cuts, and that making cuts to spending would really have adverse consequences for those people who were using it. Just with the presentation of a couple sentences of different type of argumentation like that, we could move people away from supporting austerity by virtue of highlighting those alternative possibilities and spending cut consequences in the way that The Guardian was doing at the time. So there were differences between the readers, there were differences in the coverage, and it looks like the one kind of led to the other, because when we presented it in an experiment in that way, we were able to kind of drive a wedge between those two groups.
So the media coverage definitely makes a difference. And the household analogy?
The household analogy, by contrast, we spent probably 3 years trying to make it work. And in fact, almost all of the steps, the logical steps that you highlighted in your kind of very good summary of why people thought this might be important, are slightly controversial. So first of all, people don't actually think household borrowing is terrible. Like, they kind of don't, they recognize that maybe you should avoid it, but they also say, oh, you know, if you really need to make ends meet and you're, you know, in the short term, it's obviously a sensible strategy. So anyway, there's all kinds of reasons why it breaks down. But the real take home was that across various different types of, again, experimental interventions in the context of surveys where we were trying to either make the analogy seem more salient, make the analogy seem... Actually, we tried to make it less salient. We tried to show people how it didn't really work and thereby, you know, move them away from supporting deficit reduction. We did some experiments where we just assumed that people already were reasoning by analogy, and we just made them really think about the personal budget constraint and see if, no matter how we did it, we could not get changes in that kind of analogical reasoning to drive changes in deficit preferences. What we could do was, when we asked people about deficit preferences first, then they were more likely to explicitly endorse that analogical reasoning if we asked the questions in that order, that way around. And especially those who were the most hawkish about deficit reduction were more likely to draw on that analogical reason as a kind of subsequent question. They were no more likely to endorse it when we asked it first, but they were more likely to endorse it when we asked it second. So we find no causal effect of the analogy, but we find some evidence that maybe people are using it as a kind of explanatory tool or a justification for the preferences that they do hold over government budgets.
I'd be so fascinated to ask more about that, but alas, we're almost out of time, and I just want to ask you one final question. So I've taken you into a lot of the detail of a couple of the projects that you've been doing on austerity and on attitudes to different taxes. What's the kind of big picture takeaway that listeners to the podcast should have in their minds from all of this work?
It depends a little bit on the kind of listener. I think at the most general level, there are two things. And the first one is really many things that we think we know about the way people, and the public in particular, engage with economic policy reasoning. Many of the things we think we know, it's not that they're wrong, but it's that we don't actually know that we know them. And then the second thing is, well, why is this? What's wrong with economists and political scientists and pollsters? The second thing is that it's actually really hard to find out. And so, the taxation paper that we talked about, we didn't get into all of the gruesome methodological details, but it takes quite a lot of kind of empirical engineering to be able to present the question that's meaningful on the policy side in a way that is accessible to the public such that we're reasonably confident that we're kind of eliciting a real kind of response. And that's even when you're trying quite hard to find out a relatively disinterested version of what's going on out there. There are many reasons why we ask the public, what do you think about economic policy issue A, B, or C? And there are many different types of people out there who are actually kind of not that disinterested. And this is not casting aspersions on those reasons for asking public questions. Sometimes what you really want to know is, can we show that there is support for this? And if you want to do that, you're going to ask a very different set of questions. And we can learn something about the disinterested view from those engagements, but we also can't learn everything that we need to know. So I think there's just a huge amount of ignorance is just a very strong word. I don't really mean it as kind of negatively as that comes out, but there's a huge amount of descriptive uncertainty out there. And it's not because researchers are incompetent, it's because it's really hard. It's also changing all the time. So the austerity issue, which I spent 10 years working on, I think now probably wouldn't even meet that bar of importance. My lower version of the bar of, is this important to people? Current economic concerns that are of much more political import center on other questions, whether that's climate transition, price stability, those kinds of things. It's not all about austerity anymore. It may be again in the future. We don't know.
So people's attitudes should matter in politics. How they actually matter is pretty complex, and that's at least partly because understanding what people think is actually really hard. And one of the great contributions that you're making is precisely developing our understanding of how can we understand these kinds of issues.
I hope so. I think that's a generous interpretation.
That seems an entirely fair interpretation to me. Lucy, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting scamper through all sorts of different issues to do with people's attitudes to economic policy and how we research those as well. And if listeners want to learn more about these things, then Lucy's lecture on a lot of the issues that we've been talking about is also available and is an absolutely fantastic watch. And we'll put in the show notes for the episode the details of that and also some of Lucy's published papers as well. We will be back next week with more cutting-edge research about politics. I confess I'm not exactly sure yet what the topic will be, but rest assured that it will be well worth a listen, whatever it is. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Alice Hart and Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.